Hello and welcome to part 4 of the QED lecture on randomized controlled trials, or RCTs. And now we've introduced RCTs and how they work, we'll look at some criticisms of this method. So there's a list of 5 criticisms here, and we'll look at each of these in turn, starting with practical feasibility. So in terms of practical feasibility, well, for a start, there's the cost. If you remember, in an RCT, there is the X, the intervention. So whereas with standard research, you're just going to gather data to make measurements, to ask people questions. Here you've actually got to be doing something. So you have to be building a road or building toilets or providing savings accounts to those tobacco farmers or providing training to people. So there's an input that has to be provided. So that's a cost. So that's the first big barrier. Then there's contamination effects. Now this is where there's the effect on the treatment group might spill over, so it influences the behaviour of the control group. And that can be in different ways. It could be direct. So if you're providing microcredits or training to people, then the people that beneficiaries of that might be sharing it. So it could be that people in the extended family, for example, will share the credit they've been given to help people that are not in the treatment group. So that would contaminate the effects. Or if we're giving training to people on agricultural techniques, even if they're in a different village, these days with mobile phones, they just can simply ring up and share the information. Or there's more subtle things such as demonstration effects. It could be that if you're teaching the treatment group better ways to farm, better ways to market their products, people of the control group could imitate that. So that would reduce the difference you observe. Or the opposite to that is that people of the control group could see people in the treatment group getting these advantages and feel discouraged and give up on fulfilling that because they think they're at a disadvantage. So that would exaggerate the difference. So that's contamination effects. And then there are what's called blinding doubts. And blinding is a term that's used in experimental science, medicine and elsewhere. And RCT assumes that neither the subject nor the researcher knows which group they're in, treatment or control. Such as when you take medicine, if you're in a medical trial, you get given some tablets to take and you don't know whether they're the real McCoy or just a sugar pill. Unless you're in a homeopathy trial, in which case it makes no difference. But seriously, if you're in a medical trial, you don't know whether you have the real medicine or just an artificial substitute, and neither does the person that's researching on you. There'll be some sort of code system they can only find out later on which one you've got. So the way that you behave and the way that they behave towards you can't influence the effect that the pills themselves have. That's called double blinding. And how is that going to be possible in microfinance? I mean, because you can't not know whether you've been given microfinance. You can't be sort of unaware whether you've had a school built in your village. And if you're the person building the school, you don't know. It just can't be recreated. So even single blinding is very hard, let alone double blinding. So there are all sorts of question marks about the effects you see that could be caused by the differences in behaviour. Then you have heterogeneous response, which is the idea that whatever it is you're intervening could affect different subjects differently. So the overall effect might come out as small, so nothing much has happened. But then you might find that within those groups, there are particular subcategories where it has had an effect. For example, you could be giving out business loans, or microcredit loans, or business training, and those people, even though in the whole area there's no difference in average between the treatment and control groups, it could turn out that within those groups, the ones that are already in business in the treatment groups have a much better boost to their income than the ones that are already in business outside in the control groups. So what you can do then is you do subgroup analysis. However, the temptation then is that you don't actually end up reporting in your paper or your report, okay, actually overall there was no effect. You just single out where there was an effect in the subgroup. But that leads you into the danger of data mining, which is if you have any average group of people and you start looking at different subgroups within there, eventually, just by chance, you're going to find that there was a difference between two subgroups. So the statistical test you use then really is no longer valid. So you need more sophisticated statistical techniques still to overcome that. And the whole idea of RCTs is they're supposed to get away from needing more and more sophisticated stats. The next objection is the idea of external validity, which I hope you're all familiar with. And that's the idea that whatever you find out from your particular sample, your study, is generalizable to other areas. But if you do a microcredit intervention by the Grameen Bank in India, is that the same as doing a microcredit intervention by the Al Amana, I think it was a survey on transport and taxis in Morocco? Is a fall in class sizes in one particular country from 40 to 35 the same as a fall from 30 to 25? It's both a fall of 5, but is that the same? Do the same individual institutional effects affect an intervention in Manila and Addis Ababa? And if you start scaling things up, can you expect the same results? And Angus Dayton, one of the most prominent critics, he says that if you have a small development project that helps a few villages, that might not affect the attention of corrupt public officials, because that's not worth their while yet to go and undermine and exploit them. It's just a small scale. But it would be worth it as soon as that scale is a national scale or regional scale for local corrupt public officials to think, hello, what's going on here? And their behaviour would change. The scientists who run the experiments on these small scale things are likely to be much more careful and conscientious than the bureaucrats, the lowly paid bureaucrats, would be once it's scaled up to a national scale. So there's no guarantee that the policy that you test with an RCT in a trial is going to have the same effects when it's a real policy and scaled up in the real world. If you start some new approach to education in some villages, randomised villages in India, for example, that holds many things constant that couldn't be said to be constant if you take that whole program and put it in Guatemala or Vietnam. And the atheoretical, the non-theoretical nature of the RCT, because you're not trying to test a theory about why a certain intervention works. You're just looking at the numbers saying, hey, this had an effect. There's no explanation of why. That's the strength of it, because it lets you say that in this situation it definitely had an effect. But that limits the degree to which you can claim it has an effect somewhere else, because you're not measuring and taking account all these other factors that are different in other places. This is one of the strongest and most effective criticisms, in my view at least. Then there's limited applicability. Okay, you can do it on microcredits, village toilets, savings banks, training schemes, solar panels and so on. But can you do it on major infrastructure? If you're not sure where to put roads in India, can you randomly select some districts and just build some roads to see if they work? I mean, the colossal expenditure is involved. Can you put a water system in using one particular type of pumping and water management system just to test it? Not really. With and without makes the spillover hard to capture, because there's almost bound to be effects on large scale between the treatment and the control groups. And Deaton again says he thinks that, and other people have said this as well, that it's a method, because there's so much funding and attention given now to RCTs, that people are looking for things they can apply an RCT to, rather than for looking for things that we need to know about. And then there's the problem of distortion. If they become the only approved method or so well known, then that distorts knowledge, because people carry out lots of these things, and you run into the problems of publication bias, or suppression of negative findings that you'll talk about later in the semester. The next objection is an ethical objection. Been described as playing roulette with the poor. Now, is it justified to play roulette, to essentially experiment on poor people in this way? And sometimes that's countered by people saying, okay, if that's not ethical, is it any more ethical to conduct an untested intervention? So if instead of testing things out, you just think, I think this works, let's go ahead without testing it, is that even worse? Informed consent. When you're getting people to take part in an experiment, then they should give informed consent. But is it really possible for people to understand the full implications of what's being carried out in lots of these trials? So is it often obtained in practice anyway? And does it overcome the ethical doubts, even if you do overcome this? Because, I mean, are poor people really, you're saying, we're thinking of putting this intervention into your village, would you like to have this or not? And if there's a possibility they're going to get some much needed resources, are they really in any position to say no? They might feel compelled to for reasons of getting money or for power reasons. And here's an example of this. Let's say a rural town has high malaria rates, and you know that many children under 5 are dying from malaria. So you decide to have a trial, a randomised control trial among 1,200 families, which you randomly select and you put into 2 groups of 600. The treatment group are given free bed nets, and then 6 months later you come back and you measure the health outcomes afterwards. So you measure it before and you measure it afterwards. And you find that in the treatment group that had the nets, those children have got a much lower malaria rate than the control group. And within that group, sadly, there's been 1 death of an under 5-year-old compared to 4 deaths in the control group. So 1 malaria death in the treatment group compared to 4 in the control group. So is that an ethical experiment to carry out? So I think you should pause the video here and think about that, and maybe we could talk about this. Is that justified in your eyes, that kind of experiment? Okay, hopefully you've thought about that. It's not easy to answer those questions. There are some responses that the randomists, as they're called, the proponents of this, have put forward, that on the grounds of practical feasibility and limited applicability. They said they're not claiming that they're not claiming that you should stop doing macroeconomic policy and national level planning, but they're just saying that their tools are useful in some circumstances. And the feasibility, they turn that to an advantage because they do work with all kinds of organisations that are already carrying out interventions. And they, as we'll see later in one of the research designs, and many of the experiments that you'll see talks about on Esther Dufflow's JPAL website, many of those have been carried out in partnership with local authorities or governments or NGOs of various sorts. They claim that heterogeneous response can be addressed by good research design, and you'll see some examples of that. They say that external validity, the problem of generalisation, okay, that's true, but what you can do is run many of these trials in many different places and accumulate knowledge from different places and use that to work out how things vary from place to place. And the ethical examples, the ethical objections, they say that, okay, consent is important and you have to keep in mind that these things are being done for the greater good. So it could be that the control group don't get such a great deal, but you're going to learn something, which means that in future, a wider number of people will benefit. Plus, some alternative designs that we'll look at in a minute can address this. So in the next part of the lecture, we'll look at some of the further different designs that have been put forward for RCTs. But for now, thanks for watching.